It all began when a young girl arrived at the Duke of Willits's estate and became engaged to their only heir. She wore a white and pink dress with black hair and eyes. She was just 14 and her name was Ile. She was merely a noble woman born in the countryside. The House of Willot was a prestigious noble family known for producing the greatest knights of the empire. Everyone treated Ile as though she were their own daughter regardless of her background. She was always the first to receive precious gifts. Once the Duchess even warmly asked her to become a support for the young Duke. They treated her so kindly that even their son Finnel felt a twinge of jealousy. And in return for all that kindness, the girl loved them with all her heart. Ile was usually busy learning her duties as the future Duchess of the Willot household from the current Duchess. Meanwhile, Finnel devoted himself entirely to mastering the sword. Rarely did they get the chance to sit down and truly talk. But that didn't mean their relationship was bad. It wasn't passionate like lovers, nor warm like close friends. Yet, whenever they had the chance to exchange a word, they never argued. Instead, they encouraged one another, teased, and playfully joked. For Ile, it was like a fairy tale. She was happy living with the Willot family until one fateful, unpredictable day when everything changed. It felt as though fate had played a cruel trick on her. That day, a heavy storm hit. Ile worried about the people of the Dutch, but her maid, Misa, reassured her that they knew the storm was coming and had prepared for it. The maid was convinced Lady Ile would become a wonderful duchess, kind, considerate, and beloved. And she wasn't the only one who thought so. But their sweet conversation was suddenly interrupted. It turned out that the carriage carrying the Duke and Duchess had been swept off the road by the storm. Ile leapt to her feet and rushed to Finnel. Through tears, she could barely explain the tragedy. The young Duke comforted her, clinging to hope that his parents were safe and would return alive. Everyone prayed and believed to the very end. But heaven was cruel and did not heed their prayers. The young Duke tragically lost both of his parents and inherited the title far earlier than he had ever expected. Finnel grew deeply withdrawn, isolating himself in the training hall. Meanwhile, Ile remained his fiancée, but had to take on all the responsibilities of a duchess. And on top of that, many duties that should have belonged to the heir himself. Their wedding and coming-of-age ceremony were postponed for 3 years to mourn the Duke and Duchess's passing. But one day, the Emperor suddenly declared war on neighboring kingdoms. Finnel was called to the front lines. 6 long years passed before the war finally ended. Lady Ile prepared for his return. Her attendants asked if she was happy to see His Grace after all that time. When they urged her to look in the mirror, they couldn't hold back smiles and compliments. Ile blushed lightly at their flattery. She put on a blue silk dress and fine jewelry. It had been so long since she last dressed like this. Somehow it felt out of place. While Finnel was away at war, much had happened. Epidemics, famine, plague. Ile was grateful they had survived those hardships. And now they would finally be reunited. She couldn't help but wonder how much he had changed over those 6 long years. Word came that Finn was returning. It was time for her to meet him. Still, she worried about her appearance and whether everything was ready for the Duke's arrival. All the servants gathered to greet the young master, Ile among them. She didn't feel a sudden rush of passion or love for him. But since they were meant to marry upon his return, she wanted to believe everything would work out. She wanted to believe things would be all right. But fate thought otherwise. Finelot returned from the battlefield with another woman in his arms. Ile was shocked and terrified all at once. It felt as if her entire world shattered into pieces. She didn't want to believe her eyes. She had waited 6 years for him only to see him carrying another woman. The woman had silky shining blonde hair, a refined and elegant figure, and skin as soft as porcelain. But something else caught Isla's eye. The woman was pregnant. Isla's mind filled with 1,000 questions she was afraid to ask. One above all, what will happen to me now? She heard the servants whispering behind her, and her legs shook even more. At once, Misa, the maid, and Isla's friend, ordered the servants to hush. She tried to comfort her lady, insisting Final would never be so cruel, and that there must be another explanation. Isla wanted to believe her, but she didn't know what to believe. If that woman truly carried Final's child, what should she do? Should she act like other scorned women, lashing out and clawing at the woman in his arms? Or should she wear the mask of a composed aristocrat, hiding her fury behind cold indifference? But after a moment's thought, she asked herself, did she even have the right to be angry? After all, she wasn't his wife, only his betrothed. Still Layla Thesa, not Layla Willalir, still just a guest in the Willilad household. Dismounting from his horse, as if nothing was wrong, Final asked why the atmosphere around the estate was so gloomy, and if it was because of his absence. Walking up to her with a joking smile, he asked why she was so silent. Was she not happy to see him after all these years? But Isla, hiding her anger and sorrow behind a sweet face, laughed it off and said she was simply a little surprised. The Duke didn't even realize what had shocked her so deeply. It seemed he either couldn't see her feelings or simply didn't care. Isla's face could no longer mask her sorrow and astonishment. Thoughts swirled in her mind. Maybe he's testing me. Maybe the child isn't his. Maybe there's another explanation. She didn't want to believe it, but it seemed like the truth. After all, he treated that woman with a tenderness he had never shown her. And his gaze, it was completely different. Gentle, full of care and love. Behind her, the whispers started up again. The servants murmured that it wasn't right to treat Lady Isla this way. They couldn't believe their eyes. Could it really be that their Duke was acting like this right in front of his own fiancée? She couldn't silence them, and her head was swarming with thoughts. Why was he behaving this way? Did he really not care? Even if their engagement was just a shallow agreement, she still felt abandoned. Meanwhile, without even glancing at Isla, Final asked Misa to prepare a room for his beloved Sicily, and inquired which one she would prefer. The woman replied that she'd like a room with good lighting. At her answer, the Duke ordered that Lady Sicily be taken to the far east chamber on the second floor. Misa and Isla were shocked. It had once belonged to the late Duchess, his mother. Isla tried to protest, saying that the chamber should belong only to the Duchess, and he couldn't just let anyone stay there. But the young Duke replied that his father had used this room, just as Isla herself had. The girl objected, insisting that she had only ever used that room for work and had never under any circumstances stayed there overnight, but he refused to listen, finally saying that the chamber was simply the best lit. Unable to stand it, Isla frowned and suggested he choose another. Before she could finish, Final cut her off, raising his voice. He declared that he didn't care about the rules because he was now lord of these lands and his word was law. After that, the young Duke ordered his command to be carried out and demanded a maid be assigned to take special care of his beloved. Isla accepted his decision, though deep inside she still believed it was wrong. Misa and Lady Sicily went off toward the manor. As they walked, the woman glanced back at Isla, wearing a smug smile. Once the maid and lady were out of Final's sight, he finally turned his attention to Isla's face. He asked if she was upset. Holding back her emotions, she replied, no. He took that as the truth, believing everything was fine. When in fact, it was anything but. For Isla, it felt like a nightmare. The man she was supposed to marry had returned from 6 years of war only to let a stranger take the Duchess's chambers. The thought tormented her, but whenever someone asked if she was all right, her answer was always, I'm fine. She couldn't admit what was eating at her, thinking it would only make things worse. She had gone through so much trouble dressing and preparing to welcome him home, longing to greet him sincerely. And instead, she saw the man she'd waited for return, carrying another woman in his arms. She wanted to push everything aside and lock herself in her room for weeks. But despite it all, she kept working, hiding her feelings behind the mask of a sweet, naive girl. She ordered the servants to prepare for dinner and to escort the guests to her room. Still, that smug smile wouldn't leave her mind. So, she asked Misa to report to her immediately if she noticed anything suspicious, even though Isla's position didn't truly allow her to make such requests. To distract herself, she threw all her energy into work. It had been 9 years since Isla first began overseeing the Duke's duties. After days of preparing for the celebration, now it was time to catch up on overdue documents. At first, many doubted whether she could really handle the role of acting Duchess. But as time passed, they came to accept her. Still, mistakes were never forgiven. Everything had to be perfect. That's why the girl poured her heart into every single task, determined to achieve flawless results. Outside, a storm broke out, mirroring the feelings Isla longed to bury. She barely noticed, too absorbed in her work. Then thunder cracked, making her jump in fright. It wasn't the storm that scared her. It was the painful memory it dragged back. The tragic night when the Duke and Duchess had died, the night she had cried for hours. The thought crept into her mind, maybe Finnell had forgotten that night, and the pain she endured. Maybe that's why he allowed that woman to stay in the Duchess's chamber, and then casually asked if she was sad. Her thoughts were interrupted by the maid. Knocking softly, Misa said dinner was ready. Calming herself, Isla left her room. She didn't want to miss the chance to share at least one meal at the same table with Finnell, even if only out of courtesy. Still, sitting across from him would feel unbearably awkward given the situation. As she escorted Lady Isla to the Great Hall, Misa muttered that no matter how much time had passed, what had happened was unacceptable, and a terrible disrespect to her lady. Isla felt a bit lighter at those words, glad someone else shared her feelings. Misa always helped her, and despite being just a maid, she often spoke to Isla with the warmth of an older sister. With the Duke's return, the manor seemed to come alive again, buzzing with energy. Isla wanted to slip past everyone quietly so as not to disturb the atmosphere. As she passed, she noticed a servant pushing a cart loaded with what looked like food. At first, she didn't pay much attention and let her go, but then turned back and stopped the maid. The servant looked nervous. Isla asked where she was taking the cart since it was nearly time for dinner. It turned out the Duke had requested his meal be brought to his chamber, saying he was too exhausted from travel to join the dining hall. To Isla, those words felt like a knife in her already broken heart. Another dark thought crept in. Did Finnell no longer consider her part of his family? Or had anyone here ever truly thought of her that way? The late Duke and Duchess had said they treated her like their own daughter, but to her, those had only been words. She knew she could never truly be their daughter. Even after more than 10 years of devoting herself to House Willot, Isla still felt like an outsider, denied even the privilege of asking to share a meal with him. The servants tried to comfort her. Though they knew the truth, they still respected and loved her for her kindness. Through tearful eyes, Isla looked closer and realized there was far too much food for just one man. She asked the maid about it. The servant didn't know how to say it, but Isla already knew the answer. The Duke had requested dinner with the guest he brought home that day. Rage burned deep inside her, and no words could fix it. Still, she buried her feelings even deeper, refusing to let them show. Finishing her work early, Isla decided to rest and soak in the bath, to relax and forget everything. If only for a while. But there was no escaping her thoughts. So while she still had time, she kept wondering what to do next. That day, late in the evening, Ila was once again working on documents when she suddenly heard a knock at the door. It was Baron Wizard. He brought urgent papers that required immediate review. He knew this was the Duke's responsibility, but he had a reason to bring them to her. Ila couldn't understand why she should still be handling the Duke's duties when Finnell had already returned, especially while he was enjoying his time with that woman. Before the Baron could finish speaking, Ila interrupted him. With all her pent-up anger, she declared that from now on, only Finnell would be responsible for the Duke's duties. With those words, she handed the documents back to the Baron and sent him to the Duke. As he walked through the corridors, he reflected on what had just happened. Wizard had worked in the estate for 30 years, but this day felt unusual. Perhaps the most extraordinary of them all. He wondered whether the Duke was even capable of handling paperwork. When he arrived at Finnell's chambers, he intended to hand over the papers, but instead the Duke asked him what Ila had said in response. The Baron objected, explaining that she had only temporarily carried out the Duke's responsibilities during his absence. But the young man insisted, claiming that even when he was present, Ila still handled such tasks. Baron Wizard wanted to point out that she only did it because of him, but he held his tongue. Finnell was convinced that Ila had sent the Baron on purpose just to attract his attention. Their conversation was interrupted by Cicely. She approached and asked how soon they would finish since she was growing bored. Immediately, the young man turned his attention to her, reminding her that she should look after her health and avoid overexertion. This left the Baron utterly bewildered. Afterward, Finnell ordered him to bring the papers back to Ila so that she could deal with them. When the Baron tried to object, the Duke commanded him to deliver them immediately and shut the door in his face. Once the Baron left, Cicely asked about Ila, whether it was true that she was his fiancée. To her, the girl and Finnell seemed rather close since Ila didn't address him formally and acted far too freely. The Duke confirmed that this was only because they had been good friends since childhood. But Cicely argued that despite their relationship, Ila had no right to speak to him so casually. She was only the daughter of a count while Finnell was a duke. In her view, this could be considered improper, and might even harm his reputation. Therefore, she believed the girl ought to treat him with greater respect. That, in Cicely's opinion, would be better for both of them. Meanwhile, Baron Wizard returned to Lady Ila, unsure of what to do. The girl sighed and accepted the papers that the Duke had pushed onto her. She had expected something like this to happen. She never anticipated responsibility from Finnell considering his 10 years of negligence. Yet, she also couldn't keep doing his work now that he had officially resumed his position as Duke. Ila knew that sooner or later she would need to confront him about it and also ask about that woman. Wizard noticed that something in her had changed, so he asked if she was all right. The girl wanted to reply that everything was fine, but a sudden clap of thunder interrupted her, and once again, she was overwhelmed with feelings of helplessness and loneliness. Trying not to reveal her emotions, Ila shifted the subject back to the documents. She corrected part of the paperwork and instructed the Baron to proceed according to her notes. So she told him that everything with the papers was in order and that he could now go and rest. Baron Wizard wished her a good night, apologized for disturbing her so late, and left her chambers. Now wishing to finally rest, Ila sat down on her bed. But the weather had other plans. Lightning flashed and thunder roared again and again, terrifying her and preventing her from falling asleep. She tried to calm herself down, but nothing worked. Over and over, Ila remembered that tragic night. She wished that Misa would come and comfort her. Misa had always soothed her during such storms, staying with her until she drifted to sleep. Meanwhile, the maid was in the Duchess's chambers, now occupied by Cicely, serving the woman at the Duke's orders until a proper maid could be assigned. There she witnessed Finnell and Cicely whispering sweetly to one another. The woman leaned against the Duke, frightened by the thunder. In response, he leaned closer, about to kiss her. Misa felt uneasy, ashamed, even unable to bear watching him be so tender with another. So, she turned her gaze away and asked if she could leave. Surprised that the maid was still there, he granted her permission to go. But just as Misa was about to leave the room, Cicely stopped her. She explained that after riding on horseback, her back and legs HDHD. The Duke offered to fetch medicine for her, but Cicely refused to take any medicine. Instead, she wanted her legs massaged. Misa suggested calling for a more skilled maid since she still needed to attend to Lady Isla. But Fingal wouldn't even listen and ordered her to give the massage right there and then. The maid could not disobey his command, so she humbly complied. While Isla spent the whole night sleepless, trembling at every thunderclap. The Duke sat peacefully in his chambers, sipping wine and staring thoughtfully out the window. The next morning, the girl looked exhausted from the previous day's events and the stormy weather. Sitting before her mirror, she tried to tidy herself up and cover it. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Fingal holding a letter in his hands. He wished to hand it over to her. The letter was an invitation to the imperial coronation ceremony scheduled for the following month. As soon as she received and read it, she began calculating how much time she actually had. Since the journey to the capital would take 4 days, she only had 3 weeks left to summon a seamstress, choose a gown, and prepare shoes for the grand ceremony. Isla asked in her usual tone how long he planned to stay in the capital since she needed to prepare for the rainy season before their departure. She also mentioned gifts and extra carriages, but Fingal interrupted her. He asked Isla to speak to him formally from now on. This request greatly surprised the girl. The Duke explained that when they attended numerous official events as a couple, if she addressed him informally, people around them might perceive such behavior as improper. He added to his explanation with a rhetorical question. Surely Isla didn't want to put him in an awkward position in front of others. These words troubled the girl because Fingal had never complained about such things before, wondering why he suddenly decided to change this. Now she was certain that woman had said something to him. Without showing any emotion, the girl agreed to address him formally in public, but on one condition. The Duke would also have to address her as Lady Thesa when they were in the presence of others. The young man agreed to this condition. Since they were heading to the palace, Fingal assumed Isla would summon a seamstress to sew her a new gown for the banquet, so he asked her about it. Then he asked whether Cicely could also have a new dress. The girl thought she had misheard, so she asked him to repeat himself. Fingal explained that he intended to take Cicely with them to give her a tour of the capital during their free time, because he didn't want to leave the woman alone in the estate while they were gone. The girl, holding back her anger, agreed. The Duke added that she could also help their guest with the design of her new gown since Isla was the lady of the house, and it was her duty to see to the needs of their guests. For the girl, this was the last straw. So she asked him whether he truly still considered her the lady of this house. Fingal without hesitation replied that he indeed thought so and supported his words by reminding her that they were after all supposed to marry. But the girl wasn't sure of his words. Why then would he ask her to look after that woman, especially when she carried his child? Finally, Fingal realized why she had been so sad all this time. The Duke assured Isla that Cicely carrying his child was nothing more than an unfortunate mistake, and he could not abandon or neglect his offspring. Fingal said that once the woman gave birth, he would send her away and asked Isla to believe him, because only she was his fiancée. This meant the child would be accepted into the family since her own father had once done the same, and that was how she had become Lady Thesa. Isla understood everything. Still, it was unpleasant for her to hear. The girl gave him an ultimatum. If he truly wanted to marry her, he must never again ask her to help that woman with anything. One day in the garden, 2 servants were talking about their masters. To them, things didn't look very hopeful since it seemed the Duke and Lady Thesa didn't get along very well. They used to speak like friends, but lately they had been speaking more formally. The servants thought it was because of that woman who carried His Grace's child. They also wondered what would happen if she gave birth to a boy. One servant believed that woman would become Duchess and Lady Tebessa would be sent back. He hadn't finished speaking when Ila unexpectedly appeared behind them. She had heard their conversation. The servants tried to excuse themselves somehow, but the girl told them not to come up with such silly justifications. She even confirmed that they were almost right in their assumptions and told them they could gossip as much as they wished. This shocked the servants so much that they didn't know what to do next. Later, Ila felt fine. She hadn't expected the Duke to love her. The only desire she had was to receive his title and become Duchess. This was her way of escaping her own family. It hurt a little to see her fiancé carrying on a romance right under her nose. But as long as she and Cicely didn't cross paths, she felt everything was fine. But then, walking down the corridor, Ila met her. Cicely greeted her as if nothing had happened. The girl did not reply. Ignoring this, the woman mentioned that the child was growing quickly and asked if Ila wanted to touch her belly. The girl refused the offer and wanted to pass her as quickly as possible and go on her way. But the woman kindly stopped her, wanting to introduce herself, and stated her full name, Cicely Heliot. The girl remembered that the Heliot family once ruled the Mulus kingdom, which the empire had recently conquered. It turned out Siki was a princess of that kingdom, but now those lands had fallen, and thus the name was worthless. Ila had been raised to be polite, so she introduced herself in return. The girl had no further business with her, and wanted to leave when the woman stopped her again, calling her Miss Tebessa. A royal family of a fallen kingdom becomes commoners, if not lower. So instead of calling her Miss, she should have addressed her as Lady Thesa. Before the girl could correct Siki, Misa appeared behind her and began scolding the woman. In her opinion, a princess of a conquered kingdom didn't deserve respectful treatment because of her former status. But the girl stopped Misa. Ila apologized for her maid, adding that her loyalty was so strong that sometimes she spoke too bluntly. She asked Cicely to accept her apology and bid her farewell by calling her Miss Heliot. Back in her room, the girl regretted having spoken to her at all. Misa brought her a letter from Countess Tebessa. It was from her stepmother. She had never been kind to her. Besides, she had never written to her since Ila moved here. Ila didn't want to dwell on it for long, so she took the letter from Misa's hands and began reading it. It started like an ordinary letter, but by the end it turned out that Countess Tebessa wanted to visit the Woolad estate tomorrow. This slightly shocked the girl. She didn't want to see her, but couldn't come up with a believable excuse. As she rose from the table, she replied that the Countess would arrive at the residence tomorrow. This worried Misa. Ila ordered her not to worry about it. But just as the maid was about to express her concern, another servant rushed into the room. She reported that the woman had fainted. This surprised everyone since in the morning Ila thought she had looked fine. Now a doctor was examining her, and the Duke had rushed in to see Cicely. Ila calmed down a little since Finel had arrived to be with her, so she wasn't needed there, but because of this she felt sad again. The girl continued speaking about the following day, when suddenly an enraged Duke stormed loudly into her room. This frightened and shocked the girls. Finel, irritated, demanded to know what Ila had said to Cicely. Ila didn't understand what he was talking about. But the young man was certain she knew exactly what he meant. He insisted because she had fainted right after her conversation with Ila. But Ila only asked if it was that woman who had told him so. Finel replied it wasn't Cicely since she was still unconscious, but the doctor had discovered the cause could have been severe emotional stress. Moreover, the servants told him that Ila and Cicely had definitely met today. Ila folded her arms and rhetorically asked him whether he truly believed gossip. So she curtly explained what had happened and irritably asked him whether addressing someone by name could really be considered rude behavior. But these words only angered Finnell more. Grabbing Isla by the shoulders, he furiously slammed her against the wall. The Duke said that if anything happened to Cicely or her child, the girl would pay for it. He ordered her to even watch her words, or he would do something terrible to her. From fear, she couldn't utter a word. After his threats, he released her and left the room. Isla was deeply frightened by the Duke's actions and began to feel unsafe. The maids were also scared and even more worried about their lady's condition. They tried to ask her about it, but the girl couldn't tell them anything. At that moment, Isla realized that despite all the kind words he had spoken to her and the agreements they had made, his feelings for Cicely were much stronger than she had expected. Moreover, the place of Duchess was still vacant, so anyone could claim it. So the girl thought that in the end their relationship might not end in marriage at all, but rather in the breaking of their engagement. The next day during her free time, Isla was reading a book when Misa approached her. She informed her that Miss Cicely had regained consciousness and was feeling well. Also, Countess Thea had already arrived. So the girl closed her book and went to meet her, thinking that not a single day had passed without quarrels and upheavals. When they met, they exchanged polite greetings, but there was still tension between them. After the courtesies, the Countess immediately invited Isla to the drawing room and told her not to keep her waiting. She wanted to speak to the girl in private. Isla agreed and sent all the servants elsewhere since it would be better if no one overheard their conversation. Countess the Bestessa told her she looked quite radiant for someone who might soon lose her place. Isla asked her to get to the point quickly since she wasn't in the mood for a long talk with her. The woman remarked that she was still as sharp-tongued and insolent as ever, clearly wanting to provoke her. Once again, Isla asked her to explain why she had come since she was sure their conversation was unpleasant for both of them. But the Countess reproached her, saying she shouldn't behave so arrogantly just because she had played the role of Duchess for a few years and reminded her that she still belonged to House the Besser. Turning her face away, Isla asked if she had really traveled all this way just to say such things. But in truth, it turned out she had come because of rumors about the Willets. She had heard they were keeping a mistress who was a princess of a conquered kingdom. Isla neither confirmed nor denied it. But Countess the Besser was sure it was true and began reproaching her again, saying this should be her primary concern right now. She reminded her that she had once ordered her to marry as soon as possible after the deaths of the Duke and Duchess. At the same time, she pulled a small red bottle out of her bag. Isla asked her about it. It turned out to be a medicine that promoted conception and pregnancy. But then she pulled out another bottle, this time a blue one. This one was for getting rid of a child. With a calm face, the Countess added that just a single drop would be enough for it to work. Isla was horrified at the thought of what her stepmother was capable of. The girl suddenly stood up and told her not to speak such nonsense, saying it would have been better if she hadn't come at all. But Contessa told her to open her eyes and asked whether she truly believed the Duke would marry her once that woman bore him a child. In the Countess's opinion, the engagement would most likely be broken, or if she was lucky, she might become Duchess, but only on paper at best. And Isla herself was already wondering what would happen to her once the child was born and whether she would ever get married at all. She didn't want to return to the county. The Countess added that she was very worried about her, which was why she had come to help. Isla replied that she would pretend she hadn't heard a single word of hers and asked her to leave immediately. The Countess told the girl to think about her words because sooner or later she would have to make a decision, and she left the bottles on the table. Right after the tense conversation, she locked herself in her room and reflected on what Countess the Besser had said. The girl hated Cicely, but not enough to kill her child since it was innocent. Isla thought that if anyone should be condemned, it was Finnell for betraying their engagement. But there was another side to the coin. If the woman gave birth to his child, she wasn't sure what would happen to her. Thinking about this, she looked at the two potions, but her troubling thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Misa. Entering, she gave a small bow and reported that her tailor had already arrived. Once again, trying to hide her worries and fears, Ila carried on the conversation and walked over to the bedside table where the bottles lay and discreetly closed it while continuing the dialogue. The girl also asked about the jeweler and the shoemaker. Misa replied that they would arrive a little later. Since the departure to the capital was in 2 days, she asked to tell them to hurry. The tour was already in the drawing room. Ila asked the maid to call the Duke to come there as well. But the maid reported that he was already there. This shocked the girl. It turned out that the Duke was teaching Cicely how to greet guests, so now they were together in the drawing room. Receiving guests was a privilege reserved for the mistress of the manor. But Cicely wasn't supposed to have any privileges at all as a mere mistress. After hearing this, her legs gave way and she grabbed the vanity table to keep from falling. Although Ila was not yet the mistress of this house, Cicely could not in any case take on this role. The girl felt as if she were only a puppet playing the Duchess's part with Final's permission, and that to him they were no different. Misa was worried about her lady's condition, so she asked the girl if she wanted her to force that woman to leave. Ila calmed Misa, saying that if this was what the Duke wanted, they had no other choice but to obey. Entering the room, the girl acted as if nothing had happened and said she hadn't expected to meet him here. The Duke, in turn, greeted her coldly and formally. Next to him stood the tailor. The man was shocked and confused by the situation, but still greeted her. Ignoring it, she asked if her dress was finished. The Tor felt uncertain and didn't know what to do. He replied that her dress was ready and that Miss Cicely was examining it at that moment. Seeing the girl, Cicely turned and greeted her. But Ila was shocked by something, so she only asked her what she was wearing. Cicely didn't understand the question and gently asked her to repeat it. The clothes Cicely had put on was a maternity dress that the late Duchess had given to Ila, so for the girl, it was very special and sacred. Ila repeated her question, this time more correctly, but angrily. But Final immediately intervened since it was he who had allowed her to wear it and asked her not to be angry at the woman. But the girl's rage did not subside. She asked him if she could then direct her disappointment at him instead for taking her dress without her consent. But Final only said that she was being overly dramatic about an ordinary piece of clothing. Moreover, he believed that since it was a maternity dress, she didn't need it now anyway, and that he had found a better use for it than letting it gather dust. But Ila replied that the dress wasn't gathering dust. The girl had carefully placed it in the coziest corner of her wardrobe to protect it. Ila added that she didn't believe the Duke had found the dress, and was sure it was Cicely who had gone into her wardrobe without permission. But Fennel began to justify himself, saying that they had no other choice since Cicely needed to greet the guests, and she lacked appropriate attire because the girl hadn't arranged in advance for a dress for her. Ila was shocked at such an accusation against her. But before she could find an excuse, Cicely tearfully apologized and said that Final and the girl shouldn't fight because of this. After these words, the woman burst into tears, believing that she herself was to blame for the situation because she had no dresses of her own. To calm Siki, the Duke sat down and gently pulled her to him. In his opinion, she had no reason to apologize since she had done nothing wrong. After that, Fennel ordered the servants to immediately bring the woman cold tea and a towel. On the day when the pregnant stranger had first arrived at the manor, Ila had convinced herself to be careful. She understood that this woman was a threat to her. But considering everything, it seemed to the girl that she was the stranger among them. With these thoughts, Ila and Misa left the drawing room. The next day, while hanging the laundry, the servants discussed various rumors, including that the Duke adored his new mistress, and that Lady Tessa hated her so much that she hadn't even allowed her a single dress. One of them said she would have done the same in her place and wouldn't have given her even a scrap of fabric. They also wondered if she and the Duke would break off their engagement. Passing by, Ile and Misa accidentally overheard part of their conversation. The maid immediately hushed them and was about to scold them, but the girl calmed her, adding that she already knew the consequences when she lost her temper in front of everyone. What troubled Ile more was the fact that she had to travel to the capital with that woman after the unpleasant events they had gone through rather than the gossip, even if it was true. But Misa had her own opinion on what to do, and thought that Ile should have simply left and let the Duke patrol the grounds himself. The girl only replied that it was her duty, one that had to end today. A week earlier, there had been a gathering at which various matters were discussed, including the transfer of the Duke's duties to Finel. The advisors thought it was wrong for the girl to continue carrying out his responsibilities. Ile agreed with this opinion and planned to delegate all her duties to Duke Willilot, and she asked for help in making the transition smooth. Returning to the present day, the carriages were already prepared for departure. By the carriages stood Finel and Cicely, who greeted her when they saw her. Ile coldly replied in kind, but the Duke added that he would travel to the capital with Siki since she was feeling unwell. Entering her own carriage, the girl told him not to worry about her at all, but the girl was not fine at all, for as she sat alone in the carriage heading to the capital, the absence of their company only deepened her self-pity far more than ever before. Upon arriving in the capital, Ile was met by Misa, who had arrived a little earlier, and after opening the door, said that the road to the capital had been worse than expected. Then asked about her lady's condition. The girl was exhausted from the long journey and wanted to rest a little. But when everyone saw that she had stepped out of the carriage alone, whispers filled the street. And when the Duke and Cicely emerged from another carriage, everyone began to wonder who that woman was beside him. Could it be the new mistress? Whispers echoed from all around. Ile could no longer listen to such things, so she asked Misa to take her to her room. Arriving at her room, she began to inspect it. It was a large, well-lit chamber. It had windows stretching from the floor almost to the ceiling. The girl had heard that it often rained in the capital, so she asked for a room without windows. Such a request greatly surprised the maids since such rooms were intended for servants. Ile was taken to a new room. It had small windows and was at the end of the corridor, so it was darker than the others. She was asked if this room would suit her. The girl thought it should be fine. Then Misa said she would ask the butler to move her luggage here, but her peace did not last long. Duke Finenel appeared together, with Cicely behind her, and asked why she was here since this was not the room reserved for her. Ile replied that she felt uncomfortable there, so she had requested another one, then politely asked in return if such a thing had really caused a problem. But Finel was sure that she had changed rooms, because this one was closer to Cicely just to bother the woman. The girl denied it, repeating her explanation. Cicely intervened in their conversation, and said not to worry about her. She suggested to the Duke that she share a room with him given the situation, and added that she felt out of place in such an unfamiliar place. She would be happy if Finel was nearby. The Duke agreed with her, and they went to see their room. Ile couldn't say a word from sadness and shock. Only when Cicely and Finel disappeared from her sight did Misa ask how her lady was feeling. The girl replied that she needed some fresh air, and asked the maid to go with her. So, they went out for a walk to clear their minds and visit some shops. In one of them, Misa asked if Ile was feeling better now. The girl truly did feel better, and answered with a smile. The maid was happy to see her lady smile again, since it had been a long time since she last saw it. It seemed to Misa that lately the girl had been very gloomy, and it worried her. But Ile kept thinking about breaking off their engagement, and what she would do if she ended the relationship. Since she was only the daughter of a simple count, even her own family would not take her back. She had been raised as a noble lady and knew no other life. But her thoughts were interrupted by a cry, "Let go of my sister." Stepping out of the shop, she asked what the commotion was in the middle of the day. A man was holding a little girl by the hair. When he noticed Ila, he told her not to interfere and to go on her way. The girl replied that if she hadn't witnessed this, she might have just walked on. But having seen the man raise his hand against a child, she couldn't just ignore it. She asked him to explain what was going on. The man snorted and reluctantly explained that he was collecting a debt. It turned out the girl had borrowed money from him and hadn't repaid it for more than 6 months. So he wanted her to work it off if she couldn't pay. After these words, another girl shouted that her sister had borrowed 30 gold coins from him, but the man was demanding 500. The imperial law allows no more than a 30% penalty, so Ila pointed this out to him. But the man angrily replied that for people like them, it worked differently. The girl realized that words alone would not help here. So she ordered Misa to call a guard. This enraged the man. Reaching for his blade, he said that if a girl walked the streets, she should be ready for this. After that, he drew his sword and swung at the lady. Ila froze in fear. But another sword struck his, saving the girl. The owner of that sword was a tall man with blue hair and a dark blue cloak. The man asked Ila if she was all right. But before she could answer, the attacker came running at them again, shouting. So her savior quickly braced himself and took a fighting stance. He knocked the sword out of the criminal's hands and threw him to the ground. Then he ordered him to get lost, warning that next time he would show no mercy. With no choice, the man fled as fast as he could. The girl wondered who he was and studied him carefully. Her savior had shining blue hair, sharp eyes, fair skin, and luxurious clothing. He undoubtedly had a noble appearance. Ila thought he must be the son of some noble her age, someone she had not met before. He started the conversation first, saying she had been careless, and if he had not intervened, she would have been in real danger. But Ila replied somewhat irritably, asking if he was really that confident and saying that he had jumped to conclusions. The man was slightly confused by her response. To show him just how wrong he was, she folded her fan and with a flick of her hand, revealed a hidden blade, which she suddenly held to his throat, showing that she could protect herself. This move greatly shocked and impressed Misa. The man was astonished, too, and admitted his mistake, apologizing for behaving arrogantly. Ila handed the fan to her maid and accepted the apology, though she hadn't expected it. She thanked him both for the apology and for saving her life. He was pleased to hear her gratitude. Then he asked her what kind of fan it was that she carried since he had never seen such a weapon before, and where he might get one. It turned out the girl had made it herself. After the death of the previous Duke and Duchess, no one remained in the estate to guarantee her safety. And later, when Finnell went to war, there were attempts on her life by those seeking to seize control of the estate. Ila knew that carrying such a weapon was considered unladylike, but she said she had her reasons for owning it. The man, however, did not care about that. On the contrary, he was impressed that she had created her own weapon to defend herself. He found it incredible and called her remarkable. The girl was pleasantly surprised. She had never heard such words from Finnell. But quickly recovering from the sudden joy, Ila reminded herself not to compare her fiancé with another man. So, she said she had to go. Ila asked Misa to drape a shawl over her shoulders. She was going to meet with the captain of the guards. The man asked why specifically the captain of the guards and whether she intended to file a complaint against that man. The girl confirmed, explaining that he had broken the law by setting a 60% penalty. So they said their farewells and parted ways. Misa, however, was captivated by the nobleman's appearance and manners. As they walked, the maid began a friendly chat with Ila. She couldn't wait to see how elegant and beautiful her lady would be when she became a duchess. Until recently, the girl had been certain that one day she would become a duchess. But now she doubted it more than ever. When they arrived at the captain of the guard's office, he asked what their purpose was, and Ile explained the situation from the street. But the captain simply pushed some forms toward them, suggesting they fill them out and leave the matter to them. The girl was not satisfied with such an answer and asked him to send a patrol there, but he just brushed her off, saying they didn't have enough men, and repeated that she should fill out the report and they'd look into it later. Misa was about to scold him for his rude behavior, but Ile stopped her, not wanting to cause a scene. Instead, she calmly hinted that she would report to His Majesty about the captain's lack of discipline. This frightened him so much that he jumped to his feet and immediately began making excuses and throwing promises around. By then, the streets were quickly getting dark, so the girls agreed it was time to return. Misa was a bit frightened considering how eerie the streets felt and the rumors about the high crime rate in the capital. Ile noticed a stranger following them. At one point, she couldn't take it anymore and asked why he was trailing them. It turned out to be her blue-haired savior. He apologized if he had frightened them and said he had a certain question. The man asked her how she had known that the fraudster was charging a 60% penalty. The girl asked if that was really all he was interested in, but the stranger objected and went on, saying that he wanted to know how she knew the empire had set a limit for creditors, no more than 30%. And how she calculated that he would have to pay a fine of 1,000 gold. Ile interrupted him and summed up what he said by pointing out that he was surprised that a simple lady like her knew such laws. He agreed, for that was indeed the case. Women are not expected to be able to manage territories, so they are not forced to study so diligently. However, the girl felt as though she had taken Final's place by handling all the estate's affairs. But she only replied that the subject had simply piqued her interest, and she politely asked what all those questions were for. Was he displeased that a woman took an interest in matters of official nature? The Lord was not bothered by it. On the contrary, he was deeply impressed and intrigued, for he had never before met a lady interested in such matters. Once Ile had answered all the questions that interested the Lord, she wished him a good night and prepared to leave. The man wished her the same in return and said, "I will be waiting for our next meeting, Lady Thbessa." Hearing those words, the girl realized that she had never told him who she was. Turning around to look at him again, there was no one there anymore. As she walked, Ile wondered how that lord could have known her. The only reasonable explanation was that he had noticed the crest on her fan. Misa held a similar opinion and saw nothing strange in him knowing her since she considered the girl quite well known among high society. Ile asked her if she happened to know which house he belonged to. The maid didn't know, but said she could find out if needed. Yet, the girl declined. The girl thought she might meet him at the coronation banquet since she was certain he belonged to a noble family of higher rank than accounts. Then, from the street came the sound of hooves and the rumble of a carriage. The girl approached the window to look. It was Final's carriage. Seeing her, he came closer and greeted her, not formally, as he himself had requested, but simply by her name. Ile coldly pointed out his mistake and asked him to address her as agreed. But the Duke replied that he had always felt so, though it seemed to him she was rather harsh. But Ile only cut him off, saying she was merely following his request. Final interrupted her under the pretext that he was getting a headache just from talking to her. The girl couldn't believe he said such a thing to her. Those words felt like a dagger to her back. Since childhood, they had been friends, and Final had even enjoyed spending time with Ile, so she wondered where that little boy had gone now. The girl couldn't hold back and shed a tear. Seeing this, the Duke wiped it away and asked if she was crying. Ile gently brushed his hand aside, turning her gaze away, and blamed it on dust in her eyes. Those words eased his curiosity, so he continued the conversation. Vanel showed her a gift and asked if he was right to assume that women like chocolate cakes. He didn't know what women usually liked, so he asked the owner of the confectionery, who in turn suggested it. Hearing this, hope once again stirred inside Ila, and she asked him if he had bought it for her. The girl reached out to receive her gift, but the Duke shattered the hope that had just appeared by saying that Cicely wanted the cake. From sadness and disappointment, the girl could barely force out a few words, asking if there was at least something for her. Vanel only replied that he hadn't known she liked sweets and added that if she really wanted cake, she could buy it herself. When he arrived to see Cicely, he gave her the gift. The woman was delighted. Seeing that the gift was a chocolate cake, she immediately tried it. Cicely asked the Duke where he had found such a delicious cake, and Finel was glad to tell her. Cicely asked if she could eat the whole thing, and said she had always dreamed of finishing such a huge cake. The Duke allowed her and said she could do whatever she pleased. A little later, Cicely asked if he had bought the cake for Lady Thesa, but Finel only asked why she thought so. Cicely explained that she felt terrible eating the cake all by herself and added that in her kingdom, there was a tradition of sharing food with family, and since she now considered the girl family, she wished to share it with her. The servant brought a package with the cake to Isla's room. Misa was overjoyed that His Grace had sent this dessert to her lady, and she wanted to believe that he did in fact care about Isla. But the girl didn't think so after all the words she had heard from him. Looking at the box, she recognized it. It was identical to the one he had bought for Cicely. Isla couldn't resist opening it, and besides, Misa persuaded her to at least look and try a piece. But when they opened it, they saw an outrageous sight. Inside the package were the leftovers of the cake that Cicely hadn't eaten. After opening what was supposed to be a gift, the servant added that Miss Heliot had noted that in her kingdom there was a tradition of sharing food, even if it wasn't fresh. But to Isla, it seemed more like a spiteful personal insult. The girl could not accept such a gift and ordered, "Throw this disgrace away." Misa wanted to somehow help, but couldn't think of anything. The girl sat down on the sofa, not knowing what to do or think. Isla reflected on who she was now to Finel, and how miserable she must be to ever satisfy him. Now the girl understood why Count Thesa had treated her so horribly. The daughter of the Count's mistress, for she herself felt the same when she saw how much the Count cared for her mother. She was certain that her stepmother had felt terrible, and that was the reason she had tormented her so mercilessly. But what was truly sad in this situation was that despite all the humiliation, the girl still had to think about Finel. While reflecting on all this, Isla approached the outfit she was planning to wear to the banquet. Remembering something, Misa asked whether she would add embroidery to the handkerchief. This banquet was meant to be Finel's first debut in society, and it was customary for men to carry a handkerchief embroidered with the crest of their house. Isla refused, saying that even if there were a time, she doubted she could manage to embroider the crest. The maid asked her why that was. The girl recalled that the last time she had embroidered was before Fine left for war. She had done it because of the myth that carrying a handkerchief embroidered by a beloved ensured a safe return home. The girl also remembered his reaction when he saw the handkerchief. The Duke had told her that the crest looked nothing like their family's. Yet, he didn't want to give it back. At that time, Finel had promised her that he would return home safe and sound. For Isla, this memory was rather sorrowful. Though under other circumstances, it might have been wonderful and pleasant. But no matter how much the girl despised him, Finel was still her fiancé, and she could not ruin his debut in society. So, she asked the maid to bring her embroidery tools. A little later, Isla tried to sew again, but pricked herself once more. Misa reacted by noting that it was the 22nd time. She hadn't expected that embroidery would be so difficult for the girl. On the contrary, she had thought she would succeed as she did in everything else. But Isla excused herself by saying that she couldn't be skilled in everything and that there were many things she wasn't good at. Cooking and dancing were not her strengths. Misa wasn't surprised that the girl couldn't cook, but she never imagined that she couldn't dance either. To this, Ila joked that she had 2 left feet and no sense of rhythm. But despite this, she had trained unbearably hard to improve her waltz, and she thought it had become a little more natural. Still, there were problems with keeping the rhythm, so she had to focus very hard not to fall behind her partner. Misa didn't even know this. It was hard for her to imagine that Ila had ever made a mistake. There was very little time left to embroider the handkerchief, so the girl resolved, if necessary, to spend the entire night finishing it in time. By morning, Ila finally completed embroidering the crest on the handkerchief. The girl showed it to Misa and thanked her for her help, for without her, it would have been a disaster. Misa, in turn, suggested that she immediately show the result of her work to the Duke. Ila hesitated, but under the maid's persistent persuasion, she decided to go. Dressed in a fine gown and looking her best, she went to his room. She was nervous about how he would receive it, and she recalled the time when she had first given him an embroidered handkerchief. Just as Ila was about to knock on the door, Finnell came out himself. The girl awkwardly began to speak to him, intending to give him the gift, when suddenly Cicely peeked out from behind the door and handed the Duke a handkerchief, saying, "You forgot this." It was a handkerchief Cicely had embroidered herself with the crest of his family. It was far more refined and flawless compared to hers, so the girl quickly hid her gift behind her back. Noticing Ila, the woman greeted her as if nothing had happened. Cicely went on saying that Ila had arrived just in time, for she wanted to apologize to her. Since embroidery didn't come easily to her, she had taken the liberty of doing it herself. Then she asked, "How is it?" Cicely justified her actions by saying that today was Finnell's debut in society, and if he showed up without a handkerchief embroidered by his fiancée, it could place them in an awkward position before everyone. So, she made the handkerchief for the Duke on Ila's behalf. This was the last straw. The girl restrained herself from saying too much, but in her eyes burned boundless blind fury. Noticing that look, Finnell defended the woman, saying that Cicely had put in a lot of effort despite her pregnancy. And he added irritably that it seemed the girl truly had a very wicked nature, for instead of gratitude, she pierced Cicely with a stern gaze. Ila recognized that look again. It was the same familiar disappointed expression accompanied by an air of arrogance. As if he had done nothing wrong, barely holding back her anger and emotions, the girl calmly said that was she really the only one who had crossed the line, and asked whether he did not consider his own behavior far more inappropriate. Finnell did not understand what she was talking about, but with a calm face and a cold mind, Ila poured out everything she thought. That aside from carrying his child, Cicely was nothing more than a mistress, and she should not even appear in public since her current position dictated a life in seclusion. At these words, Cicely's knees buckled, and she almost fell to the floor. But Finnell caught her in time, harshly barking at Ila. He tried to silence her pride, or at least shut her up. But Ila didn't even flinch. She continued pressing them, asking whether a girl should really hold back when a mistress tried to usurp the rights of a fiancé. Finnell tried to justify himself in Cicely, but Ila didn't even want to listen. Coldly countering each of their excuses, whether from the unwanted truth or from not understanding her feelings, the Duke shouted at the top of his lungs, "Lady Thesa." But he could say no more. Without turning her head, Ila glanced back and noticed all the servants behind her whispering among themselves. The girl took a deep breath, calming down a little, and said that Finnell could take the handkerchief to the banquet, but she asked him not to mention that she had embroidered it, and she herself wouldn't tell anyone about it either. As she said this, Ila realized that the Duke was actually ashamed of having a mistress, and lacked the courage to admit it openly. The girl turned around and left. When she approached the carriage, she greatly surprised the servant with her early appearance. The servant offered his hand to my lady and asked where she was suddenly hurrying off to, but the girl only ordered him to drive. The man wanted to object, saying that the carriage had been prepared for his grace. But she only replied that there were plenty of carriages at the estate and irritably ordered him to depart at once. The girl wanted to leave as quickly as possible to go somewhere, the quietest place she could find. She looked at her hands and thought about why she had wasted so much effort on the embroidery. Ila felt like such a fool. She was very disappointed in herself. Meanwhile, at the estate, the Duke and Cicely were sitting on the sofa talking about her condition. Finel suggested calling for a doctor, but she refused, replying that the only one she needed was him. A little later, Siki recalled their quarrel with Ila and asked him whether she had done something wrong to upset Lady Thesa. Finel disagreed and believed that it was Ila who was at fault. He remembered that she had always been like this since childhood. The kind of girl who became very upset whenever she felt someone was encroaching on what she considered her territory. Cicely was also worried about what would happen to her child. And she didn't care that people judged her for being a mistress. Finel reassured her otherwise, telling her not to worry since the child would be recorded as a member of the Williot family, and therefore Ila, as stepmother, would be obliged to care for the baby. But considering their quarrel, Cicely worried about what would happen if she refused. Finel assured the woman that there was no reason to worry because if she behaved that way, it would simply mean failing her duties as Duchess. And if that happened, the girl would have to leave everything she had behind and go away. She would have to leave the estate. Finel eagerly awaited the child's birth and deeply desired to become a good father. At the same time, Ila was sitting alone under a tree, wondering what she should do now, whether she could really keep her place in the Willot family. But suddenly, an unfamiliar shadow fell over her. A hand offered her a handkerchief, asking why the young lady was crying. That shadow turned out to be the blue-haired lord who had once saved her from the criminal. He mustn't see me like this, thought the girl. She smiled softly and wanted to wipe the tears from her face. But the man, after apologizing, took her hand. He gently wiped the tears of sorrow from her face himself, as if to keep her from accidentally hurting her eyes. Then he sat down beside her and added that although this place was quiet, it wasn't suitable for a lady like her to be alone without an escort. The girl simply needed some time to herself, so she replied there was nothing to worry about. Hearing this, the lord asked whether it was connected to why she had been crying. But Ila only joked sharply, asking if he really thought he could solve her problems just by hearing them. But he still wanted to know. The girl joked bitterly again, but the man truly wanted to help somehow. For her, it was really an awkward moment. Ila felt as if she always ran into him when she was at her worst. The girl noticed his sword. It looked very worn. The man seemed quite skilled, so she decided he must carry it for more than just self-defense. Ila recalled that Finel's sword had also looked quite worn. The lord called her name, and just as the girl was about to answer, he suddenly popped a strawberry candy into her mouth. He explained that whenever he felt sad, he would eat strawberry candies, and that always made him feel better. So, he hoped it would help her, too. Ila was so pleasantly surprised that she couldn't say anything except a quiet, "Thank you." The lord then noticed the ornate wooden box lying next to her, and asked about it. The girl tried to come up with some kind of explanation. In the middle of her rambling, she wanted to quickly put the little chest away, but something terrible happened. The box opened and the handkerchief fell out. A brief silence filled the air. Ila blushed and didn't know how to explain, so she tried to grab the handkerchief quickly, but she didn't make it in time. The lord was the first to reach it. He began examining it closely, while the girl awkwardly asked him to give it back. Noticing something, the lord asked whether the crest on the handkerchief belonged to her fiancé, but the girl denied it and added that she had wanted to throw it away, once again asking him to return it. The lord was baffled that the girl wanted to discard what he thought was such a perfect handkerchief. She no longer needed it, but she couldn't bring herself to say that to him. But the man himself noticed that it troubled her. So, the topic was unpleasant for the girl, and someone had already hurt her feelings. So, he suggested that Ila give the handkerchief to him instead. The girl took the suggestion as a joke and added that it wouldn't suit him anyway since she thought the embroidery lacked skill, but the Lord was certain she had put a great deal of effort into making it. Ila wanted to convince him otherwise somehow, but he wouldn't be swayed. The Lord gently took her hand and kissed it. After the kiss, he added that he didn't want to be counted among those lords who are only drawn to outer beauty and failed to see true value. The girl blushed and awkwardly pulled her hand back while the man only smiled, holding the handkerchief tightly, as if it had just been given to him. Ila resigned herself to the fact that the handkerchief would now belong to him. In truth, she even felt glad that it had gone to someone who would truly cherish it. After a moment of silence, the Lord said he had a few questions for her. The question he wanted to ask concerned taxes, and was rather complicated, so he hoped for her help. But the girl simply advised him to ask one of the estate workers. The man assured her that he had already sought their help, but there had been no progress. Ila wasn't sure she could be of more use than the servants, but the Lord replied that he simply wished when the opportunity arose to hear her opinion and asked her not to worry about it. And so quite a lot of time passed in their conversation. The Lord was very grateful to the girl for her advice, as it truly seemed logical to him. And Ila in turn thanked him for the talk. It had been a very long time since she had had such an intriguing and engaging conversation with someone. It turned out the Lord also enjoyed speaking with her. Then Ila suddenly remembered that she still didn't know the name of her savior. So she awkwardly but politely asked him about it. The man with a slightly mischievous smile repeated her question, but he didn't tell her. Instead, he suggested she try to guess it, and he jokingly explained that since he had guessed hers, why shouldn't she try, too? Now, his words made the girl feel a strong desire to guess his name correctly. She recalled all the lords she knew and could think of. The man was none of them. Ila actually remembered every lord of her age, but the stranger's name was still a mystery. She was now even more intrigued. Unable to guess correctly, she asked for a hint. The Lord said that his hair served as a kind of clue. Blue hair shining brightly in the light. The girl stared at it intently, but nothing came to mind. So, the man smelling said that it wasn't really her area of knowledge. Ila grew a little annoyed, thinking he was teasing her. But the man gave her another hint.